So now that I've been explaining the methods and the systems of industrialized building, we should look at the results and see whether this method was successful or not. And at the same time, we should take a look at conventional building and see whether conventional building, by the competition of industrialized building, has developed and has improved at the same time as these prefabricated systems arrived on the market. So we've been talking about prefabrication and prefabrication systems, and we have never really looked at whether the results of the application of these prefabrication systems were really popular. So during the 70s and the 80s, there was a big polemic, at least in Germany, in the US as well. Jane Jacobs, for example, in Germany, Mr. Mitscherlich and others, who have been criticizing the large scale of the projects that were realized with prefabricated methods. So the big question is, were these methods successful? So not all of the big scale projects have been realized in industrialized systems, but many have been, and they have been part of a certain tendency to produce square meters, so to put the accent on quantity rather than of the quality of what has been built. So it's easy to take a look at what these buildings were and what they were not. They were not small, they were not cozy, they were not low scale, they were not designed for conviviality. They were not very individual, and as we have been trying to use as many same elements as possible, many people consider these systems building as monotonous or not very interesting for human environment. Another question was whether the promises of these methods have been kept. So was the construction really quicker? Was it cheaper? Was flexibility that was an advantage of certain of the skeleton systems really in use, or is it a feature that has been there but never was really necessary? So were all these flowers really useful that the industrialized building process was offering, or were there false promises that led to a direction that nobody really wanted? So I'm in a university building, I'm a professor, and behind me is a separating wall, and this wall is not flexible. It's built in a drywall system. You can see that it sounds hollow, and this is entirely sufficient, and I don't need to be able to create an open area to the area of my secretary who sits behind this wall here. I like it this way, and I can keep it for a couple of years. So after a certain time, people have the tendency to arrange their lives with spatial situations and to start to like that. And if I would be able to deplace this wall here to another spot in the building, then I would have to change all the hoses and electrical outlets. I would have to repair the floor, and I would have to repair the ceiling. So is all of this worth it? Or is it maybe sufficient just to close a door and make another chair out of this part of the chair and a second chair of the other part? So there might be easier ways to obtain the objective, which was to adapt to different situations, economic, educational, whatever situation, by having flexible walls. But maybe that's not necessary. Maybe very simple ways of modifying spaces are much more efficient than flexible walls that would leave a lot of traces when they have been put to another location. And in university construction, you could see that one of the main methods to obtain larger series was to create flexible environments that could be used for a lot of different uses. So for example, as an office or as a laboratory. But as you can imagine, building laboratories is much more expensive than offices. So if I can build an office in a laboratory, this would be more expensive by the flexibility than by building offices on one side and laboratories on the other. So flexibility provides the possibility to change the affectation, but on the other side, that makes it more expensive. If a space has to be higher, has to be able to accommodate uses that take a bigger room height, then that would make the construction more expensive. So this cost is not really compensated by the masses that could have been produced. In reality, they were not produced, but each architect designed his own system and then built a certain number of elements in the system. But the interchangeability that I have been speaking about in terms of an open market, the supermarket, which would be a big standard for all systems that could be interchanged between each other, has never really worked in the way that was imagined by the authors of this idea. So one of the methods to apply science to building problems was to divide big-scale problems in smaller problems and then try to evaluate different alternatives in terms of which one was best adapted for the situation. So in architecture, what you very often apply is intuitive methods. Intuition means in your head all the influencing factors are weighed in one way or the other, then you add a little bit of creativity and out comes a very specific architectural solution that takes into account the degree of knowledge at this period of time and also all the conditions that you have been taking up in your memory. So by subdividing this intuitive process into smaller decisions and then trying to weigh these smaller decisions, giving points to certain alternatives, the question is whether you are really able to obtain a better result than by deciding in a more or less intuitive meta way. So the question is it really useful to subdivide bigger decisions into smaller decisions and then trying to make them objective by applying point systems, or are you really dividing a subjective big decision into subjective smaller decisions and lose the objectivity that intuitive decision could contain. So as to be able to develop alternatives that afterwards they could evaluate, designers of these periods have been developing very basic alternatives and then have been trying to analyze them by scientific means, where the ways that you have to walk are the shortest or where the relationships are the optimum. But that's very difficult to do, and we could ask ourselves whether to have an interesting space or to have beautiful working conditions, like for example I have at this chair, would not be more important than to have the optimum relation or to have 30% room quality in an evaluation grid when it's really the most important.